Hello. Our church is called St. Peter's, named after one of Jesus' disciples called Peter. And this weekend we remember St. Peter and what he did. Do you remember any stories about St. Peter? In the Gospels, which are the books of the Bible which tell us about Jesus' life, we hear about Peter in lots of the stories. And today we're going to hear a few of those. What do you think these stories tell us about what Peter was like? Peter was also called Simon Peter, and before he met Jesus, his name was Simon. Peter, who was called Simon at that time, was a fisherman. He had a brother called Andrew, who was also a fisherman. They were by the lake, called the Sea of Galilee, putting out a net to catch fish. Jesus came past and said to them, "Come with me, I'll make a new kind of fisherman out of you. I'll show you how to catch people instead of fish." They didn't ask questions. They dropped their nets and followed Jesus. Peter, called Simon, was one of the first disciples. He left his job and life as a fisherman behind to follow Jesus. Jesus called 10 more men until he had 12 disciples. Jesus and his disciples travelled around on foot and by boat, telling people about God, healing people who were sick, and teaching people to love and care for their neighbours. One day, Jesus sent his disciples in a boat to go to the other side of the lake while he went up a mountain to pray. While Jesus was up the mountain, the disciples were out in the boat in the middle of the lake. It was a stormy night with lots of wind and big waves. Very, very early in the morning, the disciples saw Jesus near the boat walking on the water. The disciples were frightened and thought he was a ghost. But Jesus said, "Take heart, it is me. Don't be afraid." Peter was there and said, "Master, if it's really you, call me to come to you on the water." So Jesus said to Peter, "Come." Peter jumped out of the boat and started walking towards Jesus. But when he saw how windy it was and how big the waves were, he was afraid and started to sink. Then Peter cried, "Master, save me!" Jesus reached out and grabbed Peter's hand to stop him sinking. Then Jesus said, "What little faith you have! Why did you doubt?" When Peter and Jesus got into the boat, the wind died down. The disciples in the boat, who watched the whole thing, worshipped Jesus, saying, "Truly, you are God's Son." Although the 12 disciples who travelled with Jesus began to know he was God's Son, the crowds who listened to Jesus talking and telling stories didn't always know who he was. One day, Jesus asked his disciples, "Who do people say I am?" They said some people thought Jesus was a prophet from the Old Testament like Elijah or Jeremiah, and others thought he was John the Baptist. Jesus asked, "Who do you say I am?" Peter answered, "You are the Messiah, the Son of the living God." Jesus replied, "You are blessed. No human told you this. Instead, my Father in heaven showed you this himself. And so I tell you, Peter, you are a rock, and on this rock foundation I will build my church, and not even death will ever overcome it. I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven." Jesus gave Peter his new name, which means rock. He also said he would give him the keys to the kingdom of heaven. Often when we see a statue of Peter, he is holding keys, and the logo for our church has keys in it. The keys open the door to God's love. Peter and the other disciples carried on travelling with Jesus, helping him with his work and learning from him. After Jesus died, Peter spent the rest of his life telling people about Jesus and God's love. At Pentecost, a few weeks after Jesus died, God sent the Holy Spirit on the disciples. Amazing things happened that day. There was wind and flames, and the disciples could speak lots of different languages. Peter went out of the room where they had been hiding and spoke to the crowds in Jerusalem. He told them about Jesus' life and his resurrection at Easter. They shared the good news of God's love and forgiveness through Jesus. After this, Peter and the other disciples baptized people, healed people, and helped those in need. Jesus called Peter the Rock, and Peter's faith meant he did become like a rock and did amazing things for God. However, our stories show he didn't always get things right. Sometimes he started to sink, sometimes he was afraid, sometimes he was sad. But Peter recognized Jesus was God's Son and threw himself into learning from Jesus and sharing this with others. Now you have heard these stories. What do you think Peter was like? Can you think of 2 words which show what Peter was like?
Dear God, thank you for St. Peter. Thank you that Peter was a rock. Help us to be like rocks, strong in our faith in you. Amen.